There's a version of Australia's national airline that most people alive today have never heard of. Not Qantas, Qantas Empire Airways. That was its actual legal name for over 30 years, and the empire in that name is not a metaphor. It is the reason a country of 27 million people, sitting further from London than almost anywhere else on Earth, has spent the last 8 years forcing the world's biggest aerospace company to build an aircraft that has never existed before. A jet with a secret fuel tank buried in its belly. A jet designed to keep human beings awake and alive for 22 hours in a metal tube at 41,000 feet. A jet built for exactly one customer, flying exactly 2 routes, because one airline refused to accept that some places on the map are simply too far away to reach in one hop. This is the story of why Airbus built a plane for an empire that no longer exists to solve a problem that has haunted Australian aviation for 100 years. To understand why this aircraft needed to exist, you have to understand the problem Australia has never been able to engineer its way out of: distance. Real, brutal, unforgiving distance. Sydney to London is roughly 21,000 kilometers as the crow flies. There is no shortcut. There is no clever routing that erases geography. Every generation of Australian aviation has had to confront the same question. How do you connect an isolated continent to the rest of the world? And how do you do it faster than the generation before you? Qantas was born in 1920 in the dust of outback Queensland, founded as the Queensland and Northern Territory Aerial Services by 2 First World War pilots, Hudson Fysh and Paul McGuinness, alongside Grazier Fergus McMaster. The original operation flew 2 open-cockpit biplanes out of the small town of Winton. It had nothing to do with London or empires. It was a bush airline, hauling mail and passengers between cattle stations because the roads barely existed. Then, in 1934, everything changed. Qantas partnered with Britain's Imperial Airways, the state-backed carrier of the British Empire, to form a joint venture with a name that told you exactly what it was for: Qantas Empire Airways Limited. Its job was to fly the Brisbane to Darwin leg, which by 1935 extended to Singapore, connecting onward through Imperial Airways all the way to London. This was not just a business deal, it was Australia's physical link to the empire it belonged to, a chain of short hops through Darwin, Singapore, Karachi, Cairo, and a dozen other stops, taking the better part of 2 weeks door to door. That name, Qantas Empire Airways, survived the Second World War, survived nationalization in 1947, survived the birth of the jet age, and wasn't officially retired until 1967, when the company became simply Qantas Airways. But the underlying mission never changed. In 1947, Qantas opened what became known as the Kangaroo Route, the through service from Sydney to London that airlines have marketed, refined, and shortened for almost 80 years since. In the late 1930s, it took 9.5 days by flying boat. By the Constellation era of the late 1940s, the fastest routing was still over 77 hours. By the jet age, it was a single day with a couple of stops. Every leap forward in Qantas history is really the same story, told with newer aircraft, shrinking the empire's most distant colony down to something that feels reachable. By the 2010s, the Kangaroo Route was down to 1 stop, typically Singapore or Dubai, in around 22 hours gate to gate. That was as good as anyone thought it could get. Then, in 2017, the airline's leadership asked a question that had never seriously been asked before. What if there were no stop at all? That question had a name: Project Sunrise, and Qantas didn't quietly commission a study. It went public with a direct challenge to the 2 companies capable of building the answer, Airbus and Boeing, daring them to design an aircraft that could fly non-stop from Australia's east coast to London and to New York, routes close to 17,000 and 16,000 kilometers respectively. On paper, this should have been impossible. No existing widebody had the range to cover that distance with a commercially useful passenger load. The physics of long-range flight are brutally simple. The further you want to fly, the more fuel you carry, the heavier the aircraft gets, and the more fuel you burn carrying that extra fuel. At some point, the curve doesn't just get expensive, it gets impossible. Airlines call this the range-payload trade-off, and ultra-long-haul routes live right at the edge of it. Both manufacturers took the bait. Boeing offered a variant of its in-development 777X, the 777-8. Airbus proposed a modified version of its A350-1000, its largest widebody at the time. The two companies pitched their aircraft to Qantas in a competitive process that ran for months. Every major airline watching this knew the winner would land one of the most closely scrutinized aircraft orders of the decade, an aircraft engineered around the specifications of a single customer on the other side of the planet. In December 2019, Qantas announced its choice, the Airbus A350-1000, fitted with an additional fuel tank and a slightly increased maximum takeoff weight to deliver the range Project Sunrise required. The 777X's schedule was less certain, and Airbus offered a faster, lower-risk path to a proven airframe with the specific modifications Qantas needed. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Qantas effectively told Airbus to build a variant of its own flagship jet that did not yet exist, purely because one airline on the other side of the world had a distance problem no standard aircraft could solve. But choosing the aircraft was the easy part. The real conflict was always going to be what it would take to actually build it and what it would take to actually fly it. Start with the engineering. A standard Airbus A350-1000 already has enough range for the vast majority of the world's long-haul routes. To stretch that further, Airbus had to find somewhere to put a huge amount of extra fuel without blowing out the aircraft's weight, without compromising the cargo hold above, and without touching the passenger cabin above. Their solution was a rear center tank built into the aircraft's structure, adding 20,000 liters of additional fuel capacity, extending the aircraft's range by roughly 1,000 nautical miles beyond a standard A350-1000. That single modification is what separates the A350-1000 ULR, ultra-long range, from every other A350 flying today. It sounds simple stated that way. It was not. The program suffered a string of delays, some from the pandemic freezing fleet planning across the entire industry, and more recently from Airbus needing to redesign the extra fuel system after regulators raised concerns during certification. A fuel tank sitting in the center of an airliner's fuselage, feeding a modified fuel system, is not something any safety regulator waves through quickly. Before the aircraft can enter commercial service, it has to be certified by EASA, Europe's aviation safety authority, with a modified fuel system and even a redesigned galley cooling architecture to support the changes. What Qantas thought would be a 2022 or 2023 launch slipped, and slipped again, and slipped again. The most recent setback pushed the first aircraft delivery from late 2026 to April 2027 due to wider supply chain disruption across Airbus's production system. Then there is the problem money can't easily fix: the human body. An aircraft can be engineered to survive 22 hours in the air. A pilot cannot simply be engineered to stay sharp for that long, and neither can a passenger. This became the second front of the Project Sunrise conflict, and it played out inside the cabin, not the factory. Before the pandemic, Qantas flew 3 genuine research flights between Australia, the UK, and the US, using aircraft that had the range but not yet the cabin configuration of the final jet. These flights weren't about proving the aircraft could physically make the trip. They were about gathering data on crew and passenger fatigue, activity monitors, sleep diaries, cognitive testing, and tracking of melatonin, the hormone that governs your body's sleep cycle. That data ran straight into a genuine industrial fight. Ultra-long-haul flights this long require specialized pilot training and workload rules that don't exist for a standard long-haul sector, and the union representing Qantas flight crew, the Australian and International Pilots Association, pushed back hard on how the airline planned to manage fatigue risk and how crew would be compensated for it. Negotiations dragged on as both sides worked to close what Qantas itself described as the last remaining gap in the entire business case for Project Sunrise. This wasn't a minor scheduling detail. An aircraft this expensive, flying routes this long, doesn't get off the ground if the people required to fly it refuse to sign on to how they'll be asked to do it. And then, just as the aircraft selection was locked in and the fatigue data was rolling in, the entire project nearly died anyway, for a reason that had nothing to do with engineering or unions at all. In 2020, Qantas reported a $1.9 billion loss and a 91% collapse in profit as the pandemic gutted global air travel. And the airline's own leadership confirmed Project Sunrise was being put on hold, not canceled, but shelved indefinitely, while the company fought to survive. It was a real blow, coming right after the airline had already poured significant resources into proving the concept with those research flights the year before. For 2 years, one of the most ambitious aircraft programs in commercial aviation sat frozen, waiting to see if the airline that commissioned it would still exist to receive it.
Qantas survived, and Project Sunrise came back off the shelf. In May 2022, the airline placed a firm order of 12 Airbus A350-1000 ULRs, later followed by an agreement for 12 additional standard A350-1000s under a companion program known as Project Fish, named after Qantas co-founder Hudson Fish, to renew the wider long-haul fleet. What Airbus eventually rolled out is not a subtle reskin of an existing jet. Each A350-1000 ULR carries just 238 passengers, compared with up to 410 on a standard, densely configured A350-1000, a deliberate trade of capacity for range, comfort, and weight. The cabin is split across 4 classes: 6 first-class suites, 52 business suites, 40 premium economy seats, and 140 in economy, with a generous 33-inch seat pitch even at the back of the aircraft. The first-class suites feature an enclosed cabin with a 2-meter flat bed built from multi-layer memory foam, a separate reclining armchair, and a flexible space for dining or work. Every cabin also connects to a dedicated well-being zone, a shared space built specifically to let passengers stretch and move during a flight that can last the better part of a full day. None of this is indulgence for its own sake. It is the direct, physical answer to everything those pre-pandemic fatigue research flights taught Qantas about keeping human beings functional across 22 hours. The first A350-1000 ULR made its maiden flight from Toulouse on the 2nd of June 2026, beginning a certification campaign that has to satisfy European regulators before Qantas can put a single passenger on board. That campaign produced one of the more remarkable spectacles in recent aviation history. A test aircraft flew non-stop from Melbourne to Toulouse, covering just over 23,000 kilometers in 24 hours and 24 minutes across 3 continents and 17 time zones, watched live by more than 3.6 million people on Flight Radar 24, making it the second most tracked flight the platform has ever recorded, behind only the final flight carrying Queen Elizabeth II's coffin in 2022. The first aircraft, named Vega, is scheduled for delivery in April 2027, and Qantas plans to begin daily non-stop flights between Sydney and London from October 2027, with tickets going on sale in February that year. When that route launches, it will not just be a new Qantas service, it will be the longest scheduled passenger flight ever operated by any airline in history, closing a loop that started with mail-carrying biplanes bumping across the outback in 1920, ran through Imperial Airways flying boats, hopping the length of the British Empire in the 1930s, and now ends with a single aircraft doing in one unbroken flight what once took the better part of 2 weeks. It is worth being honest about what this project still has to prove. The economics of ultra-long-haul flying are not simple. Fewer seats per aircraft means each seat has to carry more revenue to justify the route, and Qantas is betting that business travelers and premium leisure passengers will pay for the time saved rather than the layover avoided. The aircraft themselves arrived years later than originally promised, and the industry has watched Boeing's rival 777X program face its own well-documented delays, a reminder that pushing aircraft technology to its absolute limit rarely happens on the first attempt or on schedule. And ultra-long-haul flying as a category is still young. Singapore Airlines has operated its own non-stop Singapore to New York on a smaller A350-900 ULR for several years now, and the jury on passenger tolerance for a flight approaching a full day is really only just beginning to reach a verdict. But set against all of that is a piece of institutional stubbornness that spans a full century. This is an airline that has never really stopped trying to answer the same question its founders faced with two biplanes in Winton in 1920, and that its Empire Airways successors faced with flying boats stopping in a dozen countries in the 1930s. How do you make Australia feel closer to everywhere else? Every aircraft in that story, from the DH-86 to the Constellation to the 747 to the A380, was simply the best available answer for its era. The A350-1000 ULR is just the last one, and for now, it might be the last hop of all. KW's father built ships. Qantas's founders built an airline that turned the tyranny of distance into its entire reason for existing. Whether Project Sunrise proves to be a triumph or a cautionary tale about pushing aircraft technology too far will likely take years to fully answer. But the aircraft is flying, the certification campaign is underway, and for the first time in 100 years, London is finally, genuinely one flight away from Sydney. If you found this story interesting, hit like and subscribe. It helps the channel and tells me which airline stories to cover next. Have you flown Qantas on the Kangaroo Route? Or would you take a 22-hour non-stop flight if it saved you the layover? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.